I had to reshoot my entire feature film from scratch because two people ruined the shoot from start to finish. Before I tell that story, the film, which is a thriller called Melanie's Grave, took 10 years to get finished and is about to be released this September. So, if you want to watch it when it comes out, please follow my channel where I'll be making more of these videos and behind the scenes stories and updates on the film's release. Now, I'm going to hold my hands up and say some of this was actually my fault. I wasn't perhaps as much clued up back then as I should have been, so strap yourself in because this is going to be a long story. I shot the original version of this film, which was then called Melanie, back in 2015 with a small budget of £3,000, which I borrowed from my parents. Now, the people responsible for this mess were a DP called Dan and a camera operator, a girl called Charlie. Now, the reason I hired Dan was because he had this ton of equipment, including a camera, lighting, sound gear, and he talked a good talk, but obviously with a very little budget, this was going to save me a hell of a lot of higher expenses for kit, which obviously was brilliant. Now, the bulk of the film is set in one location, a house, and as I had a huge 4-bedroom house at the time, I wrote the story to fit into that location. The second primary location was a woodland owned by a couple that I knew about an hour's drive from my house. Now, as director, I drew all of the storyboards and I created the shot list, and I then invited Dan to my house to spend the day going through all of the shots, which we did, but he never looked once at the storyboards and just agreed with every shot and angle that I was describing to him. Now, we actually did the same at the woodland location a few days later, and everything was fine until the first day when we stepped onto that film set. Now, I have to slightly backtrack here a little and say that I was going to be the first AD on one of Dan's short films after we wrapped on my film. So he would call all these production meetings for all of the crew to go to his house, which was about an hour's drive away from my house. But all he'd do was rattle on for about 2 hours about this new bit of kit that he's bought, which was completely irrelevant to most of us and quite frankly was like a waste of everyone's time. It was just, I couldn't understand why he was doing it. All he could have done was just message everyone with a simple couple of pictures and a few lines, if he wanted to show off all his bloody shit, but he constantly dragged us there to basically show off and be the big I am. So there were clues there from the start that this guy was not all he was cracked up to be. Anyway, back to the main story. So after we'd been to the woods, it became apparent that he wasn't going to be operating the camera, which was my intention. So he wanted to hire a camera operator, and I kind of stupidly thought this was a good idea, despite the fact that it would impact on the budget. So another body would mean more travel expenses and more food to arrange. So despite this, I went ahead and I hired a girl called Charlie, whose boyfriend Max I also hired as a camera assistant. Now, she'd already shot a couple of feature films and both their show reels looked great, so there was no inkling at this point that these people weren't as professional as they were making out. I should have realised that things weren't going to go to plan from day one because Dan wasn't following any of my shot list and again wasn't interested in my storyboards. Instead, he kept changing the shots without any consideration for my needs and the need of the edit or the film itself. It gradually became apparent that he was really lazy and just wanted to do the simplest of shots in the least amount of time. And he wanted a camera operator because he just wanted to stand around and do pretty much nothing else except change my shit. So then on day 3, he turns up and his first words were, "I need to be away early today." And that was because he was taking his wife to a hospital appointment. Now, when it's dropped on you and your shoot day is 8 to 8, what do? So I asked him what time the appointment was, but bizarrely he didn't know because he said his wife had lost the appointment letter and she was going to phone the hospital. Then he said later on in the day that as long as he was away for 7 p.m, that would be fine. Now, who has a hospital appointment after 7 p.m. on the night? Yeah, obviously it does occur, but I just thought that was a bit bizarre. So when I thought about it later, it just made me think that he didn't want to be working the hours that I'd scheduled for the film, which obviously he knew about in advance, and he would have known about the appointment date in advance, but he said nothing to me. Just landed it on us on the day that he wanted to finish early. Now, he continued to ignore my shots, and he seemed to just want to shoot every scene in one complete wide with a few little punch-ins. Now, how the hell was I supposed to edit that together? Now, when I challenged him, all he said was, well, you can edit this with that, and that's all you need. So now he was deciding how I should edit the film as well. Now, I'm the type of person who will shy away from any confrontation. At least I was back then. So I kind of begrudgingly just accepted it. Then, one day, it all kicked off big style over something really stupid. We were shooting a continuation of a scene we shot the previous day, and I mentioned that the living room door should be open for continuity. So it should be open again. Now, he disagreed and said it was closed. Now, this guy was the type of person who had to be right all of the time, and me saying something differently just completely blew his mind, and he just started shouting and just absolutely lost it. So he stormed off into an adjacent room to start chuntering to whoever was in there, and then he returned moments later to continue arguing, but bizarrely he totally flipped the argument around to say that he'd been arguing all along that the door was supposed to be open, and it was completely opposite to like what he'd been saying only a few moments earlier. He just came across as a complete psychopath, and it just left this nasty atmosphere for the rest of the day and the entire shoot. So after we wrapped that day, myself, Charlie and Max had a meeting about what we should do about Dan. Now we tried to think of ways to continue without him, but as we were using his camera, which supposedly saw in the dark and we needed it for the night shoots in the woods, his lighting and other kit, we were kind of stuck with him. So we thought about actually using the behind the scenes camera guys' camera and lighting, which would have worked if not for the 2 nights that we had scheduled in the woods. So then the next day after we wrapped, we had another meeting with some of the actors, and we came to the conclusion that if he left the film, then the film would have to be shut down, so we really couldn't get rid of him. One idea we had was to use what we'd already shot to cobble together a promo to try and raise money to do a reshoot, and the actors agreed to come back if he wasn't working on the film. So there was that kind of thing in the back of my mind as well. It was just get through the shoot and see what we have, and maybe we can salvage it and do a small reshoot or shoot some pickups and kind of help with the edit, On top of all of that, he would take an age to set up his kit. One day at the Woodland location, which by this stage we decided to switch from a night shoot to a day shoot, so we could have in fact actually gotten rid of him. He took 3 hours to set up his camera, and because we were having problems with the sound recorder's availability, Max had to step in to do sound that particular day. But Dan wouldn't let him set up the sound equipment. He had to do it all himself, which obviously took longer and had a knock-on effect for the day's shoot. And I'm sure he would cause delays deliberately. Don't know if he was just incompetent or trying to sabotage my film because he thought it was better than the shit that he'd done. And I say this because he would regularly take so long to set up that I would leave the room, I'd leave him to it, and I'd go off and I'd kind of rehearse and check shots, whatever, and then I'd come back a little while later to find him standing around just chatting. And then when I'd ask him, are you ready? He'd casually say, oh yeah, I've been ready for ages, I'm just waiting for you. What? You couldn't step into the next room and tell me that you were ready to go. He was absolutely unbelievable. So back at the woods, we got further behind because Dan kept inventing new shots we didn't need or plan for. So because of that, we had to cut the all-important fight scene at the end of the day because it was getting dark. Now, this scene was a climax to the chase sequence that we got in the woods. So I literally had no ending to that sequence at this point. And on top of that, he actually started directing the actors, and I even caught him pulling my leading lady aside, and I'm sure he was giving her notes on a particular scene, telling how to perform in that particular scene, because he obviously thought his ideas were better than mine. So this is how it pretty much went for the entire shoot. I actually lost interest in the film because it wasn't actually my film anymore. Now, I take complete blame for this. I let it happen. I didn't stand up for myself and my film. Now, he was the cause of most of the delays on set, which got us behind every single day, which meant dropping shots and making compromises all of the time. Now, one reason for this being that he had to watch back every shot we did on a tiny monitor with this little guard around, so I couldn't see any of it, and he never thought to ask me, the director, if I wanted to watch it to see if it was okay. And his favourite line would be, "Oh yeah, you can use some of that." So because we were always behind, I kind of decided not to watch any of the footage anyway, like on set, because it would cause further delays, and I foolishly thought that because he was the DP, that if he said we could use it, then it was good. Now that was a big mistake on my part, because to my horror, I discovered what he meant by "you can use some of that" when I reviewed the footage after we'd wrapped. Now, I was expecting it to be not so good, but salvageable at least. What I was not prepared for was the horror show which unfolded take after take, scene after scene. He never instructed the camera operator to pull focus, so the actors were often out of focus during critical dialogue or when they were at a certain distance from the lens. As an example, there's a simple shot of Mel entering the back gate and walking past the camera. The entire shot is out of focus until Mel is close to the camera, about 1-2 seconds of usable footage at best. How the hell did he think that was acceptable? And to add insult to injury, a lot of the shots were either overexposed or underexposed because he didn't light the scene properly, or Charlie's camera operating was absolutely dire. One of the other things I'd insisted upon was not to use handheld, and because I wanted everything steady, so I wanted to use a tripod, but Dan insisted the rig that he had would make all the shots kind of really steady, so he rarely used a tripod. Because of this, Charlie's shots were like kind of wobbling all over the place, and the framing was quite bizarre. Have a look at these shots. Look at the door frames, the walls, the furniture, and tell me that is usable. The camera angle in these shots is what's called a Dutch angle, which can be used on purpose to create unease and tension deliberately in certain scenes. But in this case, she just got the camera tilted for no other reason than she's kind of focusing in on the actors and lining them up and not framing the actual shot. And Dan is telling me these shots are usable. There was also no consideration for continuity or actors' eye lines, which often crossed the line. Now that's a term used when actors are kind of looking at the wrong side of the camera to speak to someone in the scene. And when you cut a conversation like that together in the edit, it looks like the actors are not even looking at each other. And because he wasn't following my shot list, we also managed to not shoot half an entire scene, like somehow on one particular day. So I had only half a scene with a big chunk not shot at all. When it came to the chase in the woods, I had a specific choreographed chase sequence which I'd worked out and storyboarded meticulously. But because he'd changed everything, all we had was a bunch of running shots which I could not cut together. To top it off, Max and Charlie, who were in a relationship with each other, were staying at my house for the duration of the shoot, and they fell out with each other, which also created more tension on set to add to the already tense feeling with Dan. So between these two comedians, or three comedians, they'd completely ruined my film. I do not over-exaggerate when I say that none of the footage was usable. Not one shot. Absolutely none of the shots would cut together to make a credible scene. Now, as you can imagine, I was absolutely devastated when I finally reviewed the footage. It had been a complete waste of time for everyone involved, and it cost me £3,000, which I still owed to my parents. There were some other issues, like with Dan's attitude. He would often say inappropriate things to some of the females on set and pass it off as lads banter. Now, it was embarrassing for me, so I can't imagine what it was like for the females that were on the receiving end of it. Now, hands up, as producer, I should have said something about his behaviour and not let him take control of absolutely everything. But the thing is, he was quite intimidating at times, and I'm not one for conflict, so I kind of let things fly, hoping for the best. So I've learnt my lesson the hard way, so no one will ever act like that in another of my films, ever. I've had too many people taking the pee out of me to give two Fs about offending anyone now. And to be honest, I did man up on the reshoot which took place a year later, but that's a whole other story. So after I dropped the bombshell to the cast and crew that this film was an absolute disaster, Charlie asked me to give her some footage for her showreel, but I declined, telling her that I wasn't going to release any of this footage as it would reflect badly on me and everyone else, so I would just be completely deleting everything. Now I never did, and I'm pleased I didn't, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to show you what had gone on. Another thing I do regret is telling the behind the scenes camera operator that I didn't want his footage, because it would have been no good to us if I was going to do a reshoot with different people and the people that I wasn't bringing back were then in that footage, so it wouldn't be able to be used. And then I kind of asked him several years later what had happened to that footage, if he'd managed to save it, but unfortunately he hadn't, which is a shame, because if there was kind of examples in there of the stories that I'm telling you, I could have showed that stuff in this video, which would have been absolutely freaking brilliant. Like now, obviously it was a disaster then, but now it would have been absolutely bloody brilliant to be able to show you some of the things that went on, but not to be. Suffice to say, I told Dan that I wasn't going to be firsting on his short film. There was no way that I was going to work with that maniac ever again. Shooting that first version of the film was an absolute massive learning curve for me, and I won't ever let that happen again. Now, at the beginning of this video, I said that I was partially responsible for all of this happening, so I just want to clarify. Now, the daily schedules which I created were way too long in hindsight, and I should have allowed more time for setups on set, etc, etc. I let other people take control when I, as producer, director and first AD, should have been more commanding on set and kept people in line, clamping down on breaks, delays, chatting, etc, etc. I should also have been viewing the footage as we went along, so I could have said, well, that's unacceptable, let's reshoot that again, and there was many more things besides. So yes, I played a part in all of that, I'm not denying that at all. But when you are juggling an entire film shoot single-handedly with many different working parts both on and off set, it is nigh on impossible so to do everything yourself kind of thing. So you have to put your faith in other people. I just put my faith in the wrong people, and ultimately it was a disaster. But out of the ashes came version 2 a year later, and I firmly believe that if it hadn't been for the abomination of that first shoot, I would not have gotten the great film that is being released right now. So there are more horror stories involving that shoot and the subsequent reshoot, which I'm going to talk about separately, so follow my channel to hear more, and don't forget to look out for Melanie's Grave, which will be out soon.